Not so tough now. The voice cracked across the small-town sidewalk as a younger man slid his foot into George Brown's path. The old veteran's grocery bag tore as he pitched forward, apples skittering in bright arcs over concrete, one thumping against the curb and spinning to a stop. His cane clattered away, the metal ring traveling down the brick storefront like a bell no one wanted to hear. Laughter answered. A shoe nudged an apple into the street. George's palm met the ground, skin rasping on grit. He paused there, breath measured, refusing to wince. He lifted himself with slow care, brushed a speck from his field jacket, and reached for a bruised apple as if it were something worth saving. "Move it, Grandpa. Sidewalk's not a museum." The aggressor's breath smelled of coffee and impatience. His friends smirked behind him. A passing couple looked, then looked away. The store's automatic door sighed open and shut, as if counting out the seconds of everyone's inaction. George steadied on one knee, shoulders squared, dignity gathered like a coat against cold. He did not answer. He set the apple in the torn bag with the same careful precision he had learned long before this street knew his name. Across the crosswalk, a uniformed figure slowed. Boots paused at the paint line. A hand rose from a duty belt to a radio and stopped, fingers tightening instead. Eyes narrowed, measuring distance, wind, and the space between right now and too late. The aggressor's heel nudged the cane toward the gutter. "Pick it up, now." A shadow crossed the concrete. If you believe every veteran deserves respect, please subscribe, because every view helps this message reach those who need it most. The sidewalk outside Harlan's grocery was uneven, its cracks filled with weeds pushing stubbornly through cement. George Brown knew each break in the pavement, the rhythm of his cane tapping against stone where others never looked down. Every Thursday, the walk to the store became its own ritual, carried out with the same patience he once gave to a march, a drill, a duty. The grocery bag he carried was plain and brown, its paper crinkled, its weight modest. Inside were apples, flour, and a tin of cinnamon, always the same. George baked pies once a week, not because he ate them much himself, but because it reminded him of his late wife, Eleanor. She had loved the scent of apples and spice rising from the oven, and so the ritual endured even after she did not. Passers-by recognized him, though not always kindly. To some he was that old Marine, a man who still wore his faded cap with the eagle, globe, and anchor embroidered at the front. To others he was invisible, a slow-moving shadow edging along the storefronts. He never sought attention, but he never hid either. He walked upright, his shoulders square, as though the world still demanded discipline. Inside the store, George was known for counting his change carefully. His hands trembled as he laid each bill on the counter, not from weakness, but from nerves burned by years of service and injuries carried home. The young cashier sometimes sighed, glancing toward the growing line, but George paid no mind. Accuracy was a habit he could not abandon. Outside again, the rhythm of his cane met the rhythm of the town. Car engines idled at the light. A dog barked from behind a fence. Somewhere a lawnmower hummed in steady lines. Against all this noise, George moved at his own pace, deliberate, never hurried. To him, every step mattered. The apples in his bag rolled against one another with each stride. He thought of Eleanor's pies, of her hands dusted with flour, of the way she smiled when he pretended to critique her crust as if he were a food judge. Memory lived in the sound of fruit shifting in paper. It softened the air around him, even on mornings like this one. Children sometimes stared when they saw his scarred knuckles wrapped around the cane. Their parents tugged them along, whispering not to stare, but George never minded. He had grown used to looks, both the curious and the dismissive. What mattered to him was not what they thought, but how he carried himself in their gaze. A group of teenagers lingered near the corner, their laughter sharp, their eyes sliding to his cap. One mimed a salute, mocking, and the others snickered. George walked past without changing his expression. He had faced worse. He had endured worse. The mockery of children weighed less than a fly against the burdens he had carried before. The storefront glass reflected his figure back at him as he passed. An old man in a field jacket, a slow gait, shoulders that still held straight even when the body beneath them begged for rest. He did not flinch from the reflection. It was his truth, and he accepted it fully. Every Thursday ended the same. Groceries carried home, oven preheated, pie baked, a slice set aside by the window as though Eleanor might return to taste it. The routine gave shape to his days, dignity to his time. Others might see monotony, but George saw order, and order had been the difference between life and death once upon a time. On this morning, however, order was interrupted. The laughter of loitering men outside the corner bar bled into the street as George approached. Their words were careless, barbed with boredom and cruelty. He heard them without reacting. His pace remained steady, his gaze forward, but the weight in the air grew heavier with each step. The bag shifted in his hand. One apple pressed against the corner, threatening to tear the paper. George steadied it with his other hand, moving with precision. Even in something as simple as carrying groceries, he held himself like a soldier managing equipment. Careful, deliberate, aware. A woman passing with her child whispered his name softly, almost as if explaining a story. "That's George Brown. He was in the Marines. He fought in Vietnam." The child looked up at him wide-eyed, but George did not meet the gaze. He kept walking, head level, every inch of him steady. The air smelled faintly of gasoline and hot asphalt, the scent of late morning in a small town. George breathed it in as if anchoring himself to the present. He had carried the scents of mud, smoke, and blood in his lungs before. Compared to that, even the acrid tang of exhaust felt like blessing. By the time he reached the curb near the store's lot, his steps had slowed. His hip ached with the familiar pull, his shoulder stiff where old wounds never fully healed. But his stride did not falter. Pain had long ago become part of his rhythm. He accepted it as he accepted gravity itself. The cane tapped once more against stone, echoing slightly under the awning. George adjusted his grip, pulling the grocery bag closer to his chest. The apples pressed into his jacket, cool against fabric warmed by sun. He held them with the same care he once gave to letters from home. Fragile things carried through rough places. He moved past the doorway where the automatic glass swished open and shut. A man inside frowned at his pace, stepping around him with a muttered, "Hurry it up, old-timer." George ignored the remark. His focus was forward, always forward. The sound of sneakers scuffing behind him carried a different weight, louder, intentional. George's ear caught the rhythm, trained to listen even when eyes were forward. He did not quicken his pace. He did not turn. Discipline meant never giving ground to intimidation. The laugh came next, sharp and mocking. George's hand tightened on the bag handle, the paper crinkling under his grip. He steadied his cane. His heart beat calm but alert, the way it once did when danger was near but not yet named. The street seemed to still for a moment. The hum of cars, the murmur of passers-by, the sigh of the store's automatic door. Everything fell into a tense quiet that only George seemed to notice. He had walked this path too many times not to recognize when trouble gathered, and trouble was already reaching for his heel. Inside Harlan's grocery, the air carried the mingled scents of fruit, flour, and detergent. Fluorescent lights hummed faintly overhead, their sterile glow falling across George Brown as he moved deliberately down the aisle. His cane clicked once with each step, the sound echoing faintly against the polished linoleum. He'd passed a mother with 2 children tugging at her sleeve. She steered them around him quickly, her eyes tight with impatience. "Come on, don't block the aisle," she whispered, not quite under her breath. George heard it, but his expression did not change. He continued forward, steady, silent. At the produce stand, he reached carefully for a set of apples. His hand trembled slightly as he tested their firmness, lifting each with deliberate care. A young man nearby huffed, waiting for space, then reached over George's arm to grab his own. The apples slipped and thumped into George's bag harder than he intended. Still, He did not react. The cashier at the register watched him approach, her fingers drumming lightly against the counter. George set his items down carefully, aligning them in a neat row. His wallet came out slowly, bills folded with precision. One by one, he counted them onto the counter, each laid flat, each checked twice. The line behind him shifted with impatience, sighs rising. "Sir, you can just tap your card," the cashier muttered, her tone edged with annoyance. George looked at her, his eyes calm but steady. "Cash," he said quietly, his voice low but firm. The word closed the matter, though not the discomfort it stirred. The man behind him cleared his throat loudly, muttering to no one in particular. Some people think time stands still for them. George finished his count, slid the last bill across, and waited. He did not hurry, nor did he falter. Routine mattered more to him than their restless feet. When his change was handed back, George placed the coins carefully in his pocket. He tucked the bills flat into his wallet, closing it with the same care as one might close a letter. Then he gathered his bag, nodding once toward the cashier who had already looked away. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long lines across the pavement. George's pace remained measured, his cane tapping once per step as he headed down the sidewalk. A young couple passed, glancing at him, and then at each other. "That hat's older than both of us," one murmured with a chuckle. George heard them, but he kept his gaze forward. At the corner crosswalk, the light blinked red. George stopped, resting his weight slightly more heavily on the cane. Cars idled, engines thrumming. A driver leaned from his window, muttering, "Come on, old man. Some of us have jobs." The light shifted to green, and George stepped forward at his pace, neither slower nor faster. The bag in his hand creaked as he tightened his grip. The apples shifted against one another, their weight pressing unevenly. Each step made the paper strain, but George adjusted, balancing it so nothing fell. Precision, even here, was his armor. Two teenagers lingered outside the pharmacy on the next block, leaning against the brick wall. They noticed his cap, whispered to each other, then smirked openly. One gave a mock salute, the other laughed. George did not look their way. His focus was the path before him, not the noise beside it. The breeze caught the edge of his jacket, lifting the faded fabric slightly. Beneath it, the posture of his body remained tall, shoulders set, chest upright. Age had bent him little, though pain had pressed against him for decades. His bearing was the mark of a life shaped by service, even if no one cared to see it. Passing the diner on the corner, he glanced through the window. Inside, a man his age sat with two friends, laughter warm, coffee steaming on the table. For a moment, George felt the absence of his own companions, the men who never returned, the wife who had filled his evenings with talk. The feeling passed quickly. He straightened, resumed his march. The sidewalk narrowed near the laundromat, where two women stepped aside reluctantly to let him pass. One whispered to the other, "Takes him forever." George did not break stride. His silence was his answer. By the time he reached the next block, small frictions had collected like pebbles in his shoe. None large enough to stop him, but each noticeable, each pressing. Still, his pace never faltered. His walk remained a march, slow but steady, as it always had. The sun caught on the glass windows of the corner store, casting his reflection beside the display of advertisements. He saw himself as others saw him, the old soldier with the cane, the steady figure that seemed out of place in a town moving faster than him. But unlike them, he felt no impatience with his reflection. He accepted it. The bag shifted again, its corner beginning to soften under the pressure of the apples. George adjusted it closer to his chest, his grip firmer now. He had carried heavier things than groceries. He had walked with burdens far beyond paper and fruit. He would not stumble here. Voices ahead grew louder, careless laughter rolling off brick walls. George knew the sound, the kind of voices that looked for amusement in weakness, that carried the sharpness of boredom edged into cruelty. His steps carried him closer, unhurried, steady as always. The cane tapped against the crack in the sidewalk, its sound clear, rhythmic. Each tap was an announcement. He was coming, he was present, he would not be pushed aside. The world around him might not see it, but George Brown still walked with the discipline of a Marine. And waiting just ahead were those who had no interest in discipline, only in mockery. The sidewalk outside the corner bar was crowded with late-morning idlers. Cigarette smoke curled in the air, mixing with the faint tang of spilled beer from the night before. George Brown's steps carried him steadily toward the group, his bag pressed firm against his chest, cane tapping a steady rhythm that announced his presence before his shadow reached them. One of the men, tall and broad-shouldered, leaned forward with a smirk. He glanced at his companions, his grin sharpening with cruelty. As George passed, the man slid one booted foot across the pavement, quick and deliberate, a trap laid without shame. George's toe caught. His balance shifted violently. The bag tore open as he pitched forward, apples spilling out in every direction, bouncing across the pavement. The sound was sharp, fruit striking concrete, paper ripping, cane clattering, an eruption of small, humiliating noises that filled the air. Laughter followed instantly, harsh, unrestrained, carrying down the block like a chorus of cruelty. One of the men clapped his hands, doubled over with delight. Another kicked an apple into the gutter, watching it roll into the street with a grin. Their voices mingled in mockery. "Careful, Marine. Can't even walk straight," the tall man shouted, his tone loud enough to draw stares from across the street. His friends echoed him, snickering, repeating the insult in tones that mocked the weight of the word Marine. George pressed his hand against the pavement, pushing himself up with deliberate calm. His palm scraped against grit, leaving a faint streak of blood across the lines of his skin, but his face betrayed nothing. His breath was steady, his eyes forward, his body refusing to show the humiliation pressed against him. A woman nearby gasped, half turning as if to help, but her companion tugged her arm and shook his head. "Leave it," the man muttered. She hesitated, torn, but in the end, she stayed still. George rose alone, as he always had. One of the bystanders, a man in his 40s with a shopping bag of his own, finally stepped forward. "Hey, cut it out. He's just trying to walk." His voice wavered slightly, courage forced out in spite of fear. The aggressor turned on him instantly, stepping closer, eyes narrowing. "Mind your business!" The shove he gave was small but sharp, sending the man stumbling back a pace. The crowd stilled again, silence filling the void left by retreat. George bent slowly, his back stiff, his knee aching as he reached for an apple. His fingers closed around it with the same precision he had once used to handle gear under fire. He brushed the dirt against his jacket, returned it to the torn bag, then reached for another. The laughter continued. One of the men crouched low, picked up an apple, and tossed it lightly into the air. "Look at him. Takes 10 minutes just to pick one up. How many years you think it's going to take him to get the rest?" The apple dropped back into his palm, his smirk broadening as he tossed it again. George straightened slowly, his face composed. He said nothing, did nothing but steady his cane and lift the bag again. His silence spoke louder than their taunts, though they could not hear it for what it was. The aggressor stepped closer, his voice harsher now, as though George's refusal to respond offended him. "Say something, old man. Or are you just going to stand there and stare like a statue?" He leaned close, his breath sharp with alcohol, his tone daring. George's eyes met his for a brief moment. The look was steady, unblinking, carrying the weight of decades in uniform. It was not defiance, not challenge, simply presence. The kind of presence that had steadied men in foxholes when everything else had been chaos. That look unsettled the man for a flicker of a second. But cruelty feeds on audience, and the smirk returned quickly. He raised his voice louder, for the crowd. "See that? Nothing. Empty. That's what's left of him." The apples scattered on the ground bore silent witness. Bruised skins glistened under the sun, red turned dull where they had struck the pavement. Each one seemed to echo the insult in its own quiet way. George adjusted his jacket with one hand, brushed the dust from his sleeve, and returned his cane to the ground with deliberate weight. His stance was tall once more, shoulders square, dignity unbroken. But the air around him was thick with cruelty, a storm of mockery pressing in. The bystanders watched, some with shame, others with fear, but none with action. The silence of their inaction was louder than the laughter of the aggressors, an indictment written in stillness. George inhaled deeply, his breath slow, measured. He had endured worse storms than this. He had walked through jungles heavy with death, crossed rivers under fire, carried brothers who would never rise again. Compared to that, this was nothing. But still, it cut. And though George did not flinch, though he stood silent and tall, something had shifted in the crowd. Someone else had seen enough. Across the street, a figure in uniform moved, boots steady, eyes locked on the scene. George straightened with the same deliberate care he had shown in every step of his routine. His hand tightened around the cane, its handle worn smooth by decades of use. The scrape on his palm bled faintly, crimson threading through the lines of his weathered skin. But he did not wince. He adjusted his grip, grounding himself once more. The torn grocery bag sagged against his chest, its weakened corner stained from fruit pressed too hard against it. One by one, he bent to collect the apples that had not rolled beyond reach. Each lift was slow, deliberate, his fingers brushing off dirt with a soldier's precision before returning them to the bag. The aggressors laughed again, but the sound began to ring hollow. George's silence filled the space more heavily than their noise. Every movement he made carried purpose, as if each apple returned to the bag was a refusal to surrender dignity. His ritual itself became resistance. He wiped his palm against the sleeve of his jacket, leaving a faint streak of blood across faded green fabric. The act was not of complaint, but of order. One more detail made neat. He stood tall again, shoulders squared, jacket adjusted, hat brim set. The uniform of his presence remained intact. A flicker of memory passed through him as he straightened, the thud of boots in formation, the whistle of a drill sergeant, men beside him, exhausted but upright, refusing to bend even under blistering heat. The echoes of those moments lived in his bearing now, invisible to the mockers, but alive in every line of his stance. One of the men sneered, raising his voice louder. "Look at him, like he's on parade. What's he proving? Nobody cares, old man." The words hung sharp in the air. But George did not answer. His silence was heavier than the insult. His stillness made the mockery seem smaller, weaker. A woman across the street had stopped with her child. She did not intervene, but her hand pressed against the boy's shoulder, holding him still. They watched in quiet, the boy's eyes fixed on George as though witnessing something he could not yet name, but would never forget. George reached for the last apple within reach, its skin bruised, its surface mottled with dirt. He lifted it gently, brushed it against his sleeve, and placed it in the torn bag with the same care he had given the first. His movements carried no trace of haste, only composure. His cane tapped once against the pavement as he shifted his weight. The sound echoed, sharp and firm, like the end of a drill command. It cut through the laughter, steady, undeniable. For a moment, silence followed it, as though even mockery recognized its authority. George's eyes rose to meet the aggressors again. He did not glare, did not challenge, but the weight of his gaze lingered. It carried the quiet knowledge of a man who had seen worse storms, endured harsher tests. That look unsettled more than any word could. The aggressor barked another laugh, though it came forced this time, brittle at the edges. "You think standing tall makes you something? You're just old, that's all." Yet even as he spoke, his own voice faltered under the weight of the veteran's composure. George breathed slowly, deeply, his chest rising and falling with measured rhythm. He was no stranger to humiliation. He had endured worse with discipline intact. And now, his bearing transformed insult into silence, cruelty into impotence. His very stillness became defiance. Across the street, Officer Sarah Delgado had moved closer. Her boot struck pavement with steady rhythm as she approached. Her eyes narrowed, her jaw set. She had watched long enough. Each stride brought her nearer to the scene, her presence unnoticed by the men too consumed by their mockery. George shifted his stance, cane firm against the sidewalk. His weight leaned into it only slightly, his shoulders still squared. He stood as though rooted to the earth, immovable. His silence demanded respect even from those unwilling to give it. The man who had shoved him stepped forward again, smirk curling. "What's wrong? Cat got your tongue? Or maybe it's just gone soft like the rest of you." He shoved a boot against one of the bruised apples, grinding it underfoot. The skin split, juice seeping across the concrete. George did not flinch. His eyes followed the crushed apple for a moment, then lifted again. No anger burned in his face, only a calm that unsettled the aggressor more than fury would have. It was the calm of a man who had nothing left to prove. The air thickened with tension. Bystanders shifted, some looking away, others watching with guilt pressing against their silence. Still no one spoke, no one acted. The absence of help was a wound in itself, yet George did not bend beneath it. Officer Delgado slowed her pace, her hand brushing briefly against the radio at her belt, then falling to her side. She read the scene carefully, her breath even, her eyes calculating. She had been trained to wait for the right moment, and it was almost here. George adjusted his jacket again, tugging the fabric straight where it had wrinkled in his fall. The gesture was small, but it carried all the weight of ritual, the kind of act that kept a man whole when the world tried to strip him apart. The aggressor opened his mouth to speak again, voice rising with cruel intent. But before the words left his throat, the sound of boots echoed against the curb. The crowd's attention shifted. Authority had entered the space, and the balance of the moment was about to change. The street seemed to hold its breath. George Brown stood tall in silence, bruised apples collected in a torn bag, blood faint on his palm, his dignity intact but under siege. The aggressor loomed before him, words forming on his tongue, sharpened for one more round of cruelty. Before the insult could spill, another sound cut the air. The measured rhythm of boots striking pavement, firm even, deliberate. Each step landed like a drumbeat, drawing eyes toward the source. The crowd shifted slightly, their silence giving way to the presence of authority. Officer Sarah Delgado approached with a calm that masked her readiness. Her dark hair was tied neatly at the nape of her neck, her uniform pressed, her belt heavy with tools of the trade. Her eyes, sharp and steady, remained fixed on the scene ahead. She had been watching from the far curb, weighing the moment, and now the line had been crossed. She slowed as she drew close, not out of hesitation but control. Her posture was straight, her stride unhurried, the quiet assurance of someone who knew she did not need volume to command attention. The glint of her badge caught the sun, throwing a flash of light across the aggressor's face. The man faltered for a beat, caught off guard, then tried to mask it with a laugh. "What's this? We get a cop for a bag of apples?" His words lacked the sharpness of his earlier taunts, but his friends chuckled nervously, desperate to keep the performance alive. Delgado's hand rested lightly on her belt, near the radio, but not touching it. She did not reach for force. She did not raise her voice. Instead, she stopped just beyond George's shoulder, her presence forming a wall between him and the men before him. Her eyes swept the scene once, measuring each face. She noted the blood on George's hand, the torn bag sagging against his chest, the crushed apple under the aggressor's boot. Her jaw tightened, but her expression remained calm, her voice steady when she finally spoke. "That's enough." The words carried no excess. They were firm, direct, final, the kind of words that left no room for argument. The aggressor scoffed, though the sound was weaker than before. "Relax, officer. We're just having a little fun." He shifted his weight uneasily, but his smirk remained, brittle at the edges. Delgado tilted her head slightly, her gaze sharpening. "You call that fun?" She gestured with the smallest movement toward George. "You trip an old man, spill his groceries, grind his food into the street. That's your idea of entertainment? Her voice did not rise, but it carried steel beneath its calm surface. The crowd shifted again. A woman near the crosswalk folded her arms, her face stern. A teenager who had laughed earlier lowered his eyes to the pavement. Silence answered the officer's question, silence louder than any admission. George did not turn. He remained still, facing forward, his posture unchanged. He had not asked for help. He had not spoken a word, yet the presence beside him was undeniable, and for the first time, the weight pressing against him felt shared. The aggressor's smirk faltered, though he forced a shrug. He should watch where he's going. Not our fault he's slow. The words fell flat, stripped of power by the authority standing before him. Delgado's lips pressed into a line, her eyes narrowing further. She did not move closer, but her stance shifted subtly, grounding herself like a wall between cruelty and its target. Her silence in that moment was sharper than rebuke, her presence alone dismantling the mockery. One of the aggressor's friends muttered, "Come on, man, let's go." The tension in his voice betrayed unease. He glanced at the badge, the boots, the steady posture of the officer. He saw what his companion refused to acknowledge. The game was over. Delgado finally spoke again, her voice low but commanding. "Back away." She did not need to raise her tone. The authority in her words carried weight enough to still the air. The man hesitated, his pride tugging at him. He looked at George, then back at Delgado, caught between arrogance and retreat. His boot still rested on the crushed apple, juice seeping across the sidewalk. The image stood as a silent indictment, more telling than anything he might say. George's hand adjusted the torn bag, lifting it slightly higher against his chest. He did not glance at Delgado, did not acknowledge the shift in the air, but his shoulders lifted fractionally, as though a burden had eased. His silence remained intact, but it no longer stood alone. Delgado's gaze locked on the aggressor, unblinking, patient. She did not press forward. She simply waited, every line of her stance a reminder that she would not yield. The moment stretched, tension drawn tight, every eye in the crowd fixed on what he would do next. The man finally lifted his boot from the crushed apple, stepping back a fraction. His smirk was gone now, replaced by something harder to disguise, hesitation. And in that hesitation, the balance of the street had shifted completely. The aggressor shifted his weight uneasily, his shoulders squaring as though to prove he still controlled the scene. But the smirk he wore earlier had thinned, replaced by the stiff mask of someone unaccustomed to being challenged. Officer Delgado's eyes did not leave him, steady and unyielding, holding him in place without the need for a raised voice. The crowd's silence deepened. Conversations on the far end of the street died away. The hum of a passing car seemed louder than it should have. Even the sigh of the automatic door at Harlan's grocery sounded like a breath held too long. All attention fixed on the narrow strip of sidewalk where the standoff brewed. Delgado shifted her stance, her boots planted shoulder-width apart, her hand resting against the curve of her belt. She was calm, her expression unreadable, but the air around her was charged with certainty. Every detail of her posture declared one truth. This moment would not pass without change. The aggressor broke the silence with a scoff. "You think you scare me because you've got a badge." His voice carried more volume than confidence, the kind of bluster that frays at its edges. He stepped closer, trying to reclaim the ground he had lost. Delgado did not move back. Her hand lifted, palm forward, steady and firm. "Stop." The word was simple, the tone absolute. It was not a request. It was not a plea. It was an order, the kind that left no room for interpretation. The man hesitated, his foot hovering half a step forward before retreating. Pride forced a laugh from his throat, brittle and hollow. "We were just messing around. Don't get all dramatic." Delgado's eyes narrowed, her voice calm but sharper now. "You put your hands, your boots, your mockery on a veteran of the United States Marines. That ends right here." She tilted her head slightly, the brim of her hat shadowing her gaze. "Back away." Now. The weight of her words pressed against the air, undeniable. The friends who had laughed earlier shifted uneasily, exchanging glances that betrayed their discomfort. The bravado that had once held them together had begun to unravel, thread by thread. George Brown remained silent beside her. His bag was torn, his apples bruised, his hand still marked with blood, but his posture was tall, his shoulders squared. He had endured insult and humiliation, but in this moment, his silence was no longer solitary. It was echoed in the calm authority of the officer who now stood at his side. The aggressor tried one last bluff. He rolled his shoulders, squared his stance, and sneered, "What are you going to do if I don't?" The challenge hung in the air, sharp as a knife, daring her to act. Delgado's response was movement, quick, precise, and controlled. Her hand caught his wrist as he raised it, twisting with practiced ease. In a fluid motion, she shifted her weight, guiding him downward, pinning him against the pavement. The sound of his breath leaving him in a startled grunt silenced the last traces of laughter from his companions. Her knee pressed lightly against his back, her voice still calm, still measured. "You will not touch him again. Do you understand me?" Each word landed like a hammer, quiet but final. The man muttered in protest, but his voice cracked, and the crowd heard the tremor in it. The sidewalk erupted in gasps. A teenager clapped a hand over his mouth. A woman whispered, "She's got him down." The bystanders who had turned away before now leaned forward, compelled by the shift in power, drawn by the sight of cruelty restrained at last. George looked down at the pinned man, his expression unchanged. He did not gloat, did not smile, did not speak. He simply stood taller, his cane pressed firm against the pavement. Dignity was his answer, as it had always been. Delgado kept her gaze locked on the man beneath her. "You don't get to decide who matters. Not here. Not today." She released him, slowly, deliberately, standing tall once more. Her presence filled the sidewalk like a wall no one could pass. The aggressor pushed himself up halfway, his pride wounded, his voice weaker now. He glanced at George, then at the officer, and found nothing there but the weight of his own shame. His friends had already stepped back, unwilling to meet the eyes of either George or Delgado. The silence that followed was different than before. It was not the silence of complicity. It was the silence of a crowd confronted with truth. George had stood unflinching. Delgado had stood unbending. Together they had turned humiliation into recognition. George adjusted his bag once more, pulling the torn paper against his chest. The apples inside were bruised, some broken, but he carried them as carefully as he had the first time. The act was quiet, but it resonated across the crowd. Dignity remains, even when bruised. Delgado stepped back to George's side, her posture still alert, but her eyes softened as she glanced at him. No words were spoken between them, but the moment stretched long, binding them in mutual respect. The aggressor lowered his eyes to the pavement, his arrogance stripped, his voice gone. The sound of the officer's boots striking the concrete as she resumed her stance sealed the moment, final and absolute. And as the street held that silence, every witness knew they had just seen something they could not ignore. Dignity defended, cruelty dismantled, and respect demanded, not with shouts, but with stillness and steel. The man who had been pinned to the pavement sat slumped now, his hands resting awkwardly on his knees. The arrogance that had once animated his posture had drained away, leaving only a hollow shell of pride. He did not look at George, and he did not look at Delgado. His eyes stayed fixed on the sidewalk as if hoping it might swallow him whole. George Brown stood with his cane pressed firm to the ground, his back straight despite the ache in his joints. His hand still bore the scrape from his fall, a thin line of blood drying against weathered skin. He did not shift his weight toward the officer, did not seek comfort or gratitude. He simply stood, as he had always done, as though silence itself was his statement. Delgado remained at his side, her boots planted, her shoulders squared. Her hand rested lightly against her belt, not in tension, but in readiness. She did not look at the man she had subdued. Her gaze was for George alone, steady and unblinking, a gesture of respect that required no words. Their eyes met briefly. In that single moment, an entire exchange passed unspoken. George's look carried weariness, yes, but also an endurance carved from decades of survival. Delgado's look returned it with acknowledgement, a recognition of a burden she had not lived but had chosen to honor. No words crossed between them. None were needed. A nod would have been too small, a handshake too formal. What bound them was stillness, the kind of stillness only those who had learned discipline could truly share. The crowd began to shift in the weight of that silence. A woman who had hesitated earlier bent down to pick up one of the apples lying near the gutter. She brushed the dust from its skin and held it out with both hands, her gesture shy but sincere. George accepted it with the same deliberate calm he gave every action, slipping it back into the torn bag without a word. A boy no older than 12 stepped closer, his face pale with shame from having laughed earlier. He crouched, gathering 2 more apples, setting them carefully at George's feet. His small voice broke the silence for the first time, hushed but steady. "Sorry, sir." The words barely carried, but everyone heard them. George inclined his head faintly, not in absolution, but in acknowledgement. The boy's apology needed no reply. It had already reshaped him. The boy returned to his mother's side, his eyes fixed on the ground, but his posture straighter than before. Delgado watched these small gestures unfold, her chest rising with a quiet breath. She had not come for recognition, but she knew this was how respect was born, not in loud declarations, but in the ripple of silent correction spreading outward. The friends of the aggressor stepped further back, their expressions uneasy. One crossed his arms, his mouth tight, while another shifted his weight awkwardly, as if ashamed to have stood beside cruelty. None of them laughed now. None of them dared meet the officer's gaze. The air felt different, as though the street itself had shifted. The same sidewalk where apples had scattered and laughter had rung out now seemed like a place of reckoning. The silence pressed on every chest, demanding honesty in its weight. George adjusted his jacket, tugging the fabric smooth where it had bunched during his fall. The motion was habitual, but in the eyes of the crowd it carried the force of ritual. He had endured insult, risen, collected himself, and now stood whole again. Delgado gave the faintest nod, the brim of her hat tilting forward. Her gesture was not for the crowd, but for George. It was her salute, quiet and subtle, given not with her hand, but with her bearing. She had seen his endurance, and she honored it. George's cane tapped once against the pavement, the sound sharp, commanding. It echoed longer than it should have, as though the very ground carried it into the hearts of those who stood watching. For the boy, the woman, the silent witnesses, it became a sound they would remember. A teenager who had laughed earlier pulled his hood lower over his face. He shifted back against the wall, ashamed. His silence was no longer indifference, it was reflection. Something in him had changed, even if he could not yet put it into words. The crushed apple near the aggressor's boot oozed slowly, its juice pooling on the sidewalk. Delgado's eyes flicked to it once, then back to George. The sight of bruised fruit seemed to carry a lesson of its own. That dignity may be pressed, bruised, even broken, but it still carries weight. George exhaled, a deep, steady breath that seemed to release the last trace of humiliation into the air. His chest rose tall again, his posture as disciplined as it had been the day he first wore his uniform. That bearing alone reminded everyone present of what it meant to endure. The silence lengthened, but it was no longer empty. It was reverent, weighted, unspoken agreement binding strangers together. Where laughter had filled the air before, respect now took its place, invisible but undeniable. And in that silence, the bond between George Brown and Officer Sarah Delgado was sealed, wordless, indelible, and stronger than anything mockery could ever undo. The silence hung thick as the pinned man shifted awkwardly, his pride leaking away like the juice of the apple crushed beneath his boot. George Brown stood beside him, cane steady, his frame upright despite the weight of years. His hand was bloodied, his bag torn, but his dignity remained whole, suspended in the air for everyone to see. Officer Delgado studied him a long moment, her eyes moving over his face, the lines etched deep, the steadiness in his bearing. She had known the name before. She had heard it in briefings, in stories, in the quiet corridors of memory. Now, with the crowd gathered, it was time to speak it aloud. Her voice broke the silence, calm and clear. George Brown. The sound of the name carried down the sidewalk like a bell tolling, heavy and reverent. Conversation stopped mid-breath. Faces turned toward the veteran, suddenly alert. The aggressor looked up, confusion flashing in his expression. Who? His voice sounded small, stripped of its earlier bravado. The crowd waited, their attention fixed entirely on the officer. Delgado's tone did not waver. Sergeant George Brown, United States Marines, Vietnam, 1968. He carried men across the Perfume River when the boats never came back. Her words were not loud, but they struck harder than any shout could have. A murmur rippled through the crowd. A woman at the crosswalk pressed a hand to her mouth. The boy who had helped gather apples stared wide-eyed, his earlier apology now charged with a weight he had not understood before. Even those who had mocked fell still, their laughter silenced by the gravity of the truth revealed. George did not move. His gaze remained forward, his posture unflinching. He had not asked for his name to be spoken, nor his past to be unveiled. Yet as the words rang through the air, he did not deny them. His silence confirmed everything. Delgado continued, her eyes never leaving George. There's a plaque at City Hall with his name on it, a bench by the river dedicated to his wife Eleanor, who waited years for him to come home. You've all walked past it, maybe sat on it, and never knew who it belonged to. It belongs to him. The words landed heavy. Bystanders who had looked away earlier now found themselves staring, unable to turn their eyes. The casual cruelty they had allowed to unfold just moments before now lay bare against the truth of who stood before them. The aggressor's face drained of color. His mouth opened, but no sound came. The weight of the officer's words pressed harder than the grip that had pinned him moments earlier. He lowered his eyes, ashamed. George's cane tapped once against the ground, steady and precise. It was his only acknowledgement, a gesture that said more than thanks or complaint ever could. His bearing had not changed, but the air around him had. Respect now filled the silence, thick and unshakable. A teenager whispered, "I've seen that bench." His voice trembled, carrying awe rather than derision. His friend nodded slowly. Shame etched into his face. What had once been a figure of mockery had become, in a breath, a figure of reverence. Delgado's tone softened, but her words carried iron. This man has given more to this country, to this town, than any of you will ever know. And today you tripped him, laughed at him, ground his food into the dirt. She let the silence that followed strike deeper than any scolding could. The wind shifted slightly, carrying the faint scent of asphalt warmed by sun. It seemed to mark the turning of the moment, the transformation of the street from ordinary ground into a place of reckoning. Every eye in the crowd stayed fixed on George, no longer dismissing him as just another passerby. George adjusted the torn bag, brushing dust from its edge, lifting it higher against his chest. His movements remained deliberate, his silence steady. He had no need to speak. The truth had already spoken for him. Delgado stood tall at his side, her posture firm, her voice carrying the final weight of revelation. Remember his name, George Brown. You'll carry it with you from this day on. Her words were not suggestion but command, binding the memory to those who had witnessed the humiliation and its reversal. The aggressor pressed a hand against his knee, still kneeling, unable to rise beneath the burden of shame. His silence was its own confession. He could not look at George. He could not look at Delgado. He could only stare at the ground, knowing the street itself bore witness against him. The boy who had handed George an apple earlier clutched his mother's hand tighter, his young face solemn. He whispered softly, "I'll remember." His voice carried further than he knew, echoing in the silence like a promise. George lifted his chin slightly, his gaze calm, his breath steady. For decades he had carried his past in silence, unknown to most who passed him on these sidewalks. Now it had been named, acknowledged, revealed. And though he had not sought it, though he would have walked on without it, the truth had changed everything. And in the eyes of every bystander, the old veteran they had overlooked was no longer invisible. He was George Brown, and he would not be forgotten again. The weight of the officer's words still lingered in the air. George Brown's name echoed silently across the gathered crowd, reshaping every set of eyes that now looked upon him. What had begun as mockery had hardened into recognition, an invisible shift that settled heavily on the narrow street. Delgado stood tall at his side, her boots planted firm, her gaze sweeping across the crowd. "Respect is not optional," she said quietly, though her tone carried to every ear. "This man has already earned it. You will not take it from him." The aggressor's shoulders slumped, his face pale, his voice gone. His earlier laughter had drained into silence, leaving him stranded in his own shame. He pressed his lips tight, as if to hold back words, but none came. His friends had already stepped further away, unwilling to share the weight of his disgrace. The store clerk, who had watched from behind the glass doors, finally stepped out. His apron was dusted with flour, his eyes lowered. He cleared his throat and moved toward George with a new paper bag, sturdier than the torn one George held. "Here, sir," he murmured, voice low but steady. "No charge." The offer was plain, but its weight was felt. George accepted the bag without a word, transferring each apple carefully, one by one, into its fresh vessel. His hands shook slightly, but the movements were precise, deliberate. Each fruit handled as though it carried more than weight, as though it carried memory. A woman in the crowd bent to collect another apple that had rolled near the curb. She brushed the dust from its skin and offered it forward with both hands. George took it with the same quiet dignity he gave every gesture, slipping it into the new bag without acknowledgement of her shame. The boy who had whispered an apology earlier stepped forward again. He lifted the last bruised apple from the gutter, its skin cracked, juice sticky against his palm. He held it out, not to the officer, but to George directly. "This one's still good," he said softly, his voice trembling. George's eyes met the boy's for a moment, steady and calm. He accepted the apple, placed it carefully into the bag, and gave the faintest nod. It was enough to draw a breath of relief from the boy, who returned to his mother's side with his head high. Delgado shifted her stance, her voice cutting once more through the thick silence. "Let it be clear. This man does not walk this street alone. Not anymore. If you see him, you stand. You show him the respect he has earned." Her words were not suggestion. They were order. A murmur of agreement moved through the crowd, quiet but unmistakable. A man who had stayed silent earlier finally spoke, his voice rough. "Yes, ma'am." Another followed, softer but steady. The ripple carried, binding them in acknowledgement. The aggressor, still slouched against the wall, could no longer mask his shame. He dragged a hand across his mouth, his arrogance drained. For the first time, he looked at George not as a target, but as something greater, something he had mocked without understanding. His silence was confession enough. George straightened his jacket again, tugging the fabric smooth across his shoulders. He adjusted his cap, setting its brim level, the eagle and globe glinting faintly in the sun. His posture was tall, his presence dignified. He had said nothing, but his silence had spoken louder than the crowd's earlier noise. The automatic door of the grocery sighed open and shut behind them, as though keeping time. Each movement on the sidewalk had slowed, deliberate now, touched with reverence. No one hurried past him anymore. No one dismissed him as an obstacle. Every eye carried weight. Delgado remained at his side, her figure steady, her badge catching the light. Her presence made clear that his dignity was not his alone to defend now. She had taken her stand, and the crowd had no choice but to follow. A young man stepped out from the bar, cap in hand. He did not speak, but he lowered his eyes as he crossed the street, his head bowed faintly in George's direction. It was not an apology spoken aloud, but it was recognition all the same. The street had changed. Where once apples scattered and laughter rang, now silence and respect filled the air. Each bystander became part of the moment, their small gestures transforming the place of cruelty into a place of honor. George's cane tapped once against the pavement, sharp and steady. The sound sealed the moment, as if stamping it into the memory of all who stood there. The echo lingered, carried in the hearts of strangers who would not forget what they had seen. Delgado's voice closed the moment with quiet finality. From this day forward, Sergeant George Brown walks with this town's respect. Do not forget what you witnessed here. Her gaze swept across them, binding them with accountability, and the crowd, humbled and still, understood that this street, this ordinary strip of pavement, had become a place of reckoning and a place of change. The week passed quietly, the town returning to its usual rhythms. Cars idling at stoplights, children tugging backpacks across sidewalks, the hum of conversation spilling from diners and shop fronts. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. The echo of what had unfolded outside Harlan's grocery lingered, carried in whispers and retellings, in eyes that had seen and could no longer unsee. On Thursday morning, the doors of the grocery swished open again, their mechanical sigh marking the start of another ritual. George Brown stepped onto the sidewalk, cane in hand, grocery bag cradled against his chest. His pace was the same as always, measured, deliberate, steady. Yet the air around him felt different, lighter, less burdened. At the entrance, the clerk who had once sighed at his slow counting now stood ready. He offered George a nod and the faintest of smiles, then held out a sturdier paper bag before George even asked. "Morning, Mr. Brown," he said softly. The words carried respect, not pity. George accepted the bag without ceremony, his eyes meeting the clerk's only for a moment. He gave the smallest nod in return. That nod was enough. He moved forward, as he always did, his steps tapping in rhythm against the concrete. The sidewalk ahead was clearer now. A pair of teenagers, loitering as they had the week before, noticed him and shifted aside before he reached them. One muttered something under his breath, but it was not laughter. It was acknowledgement, clumsy, but genuine. A man waiting at the crosswalk reached to press the button, holding it as George approached. When the light turned green, he did not rush ahead. He gestured instead, letting George take the first step across. Cars idled patiently, none of them inching forward, none of them muttering at his pace. Halfway down the block, a young boy with a school bag on his back stopped short, tugging at his mother's hand. "That's him," he whispered. She hushed him, but her eyes softened as they both stepped aside. George passed without breaking stride, his gaze fixed ahead, but the boy's whisper followed him like a quiet tribute. The grocery bag pressed against George's jacket creaked faintly with the shifting of apples inside. He had chosen them with the same care as always, their smooth skins cool against his hand. The ritual endured, apples, flour, cinnamon, and the memory of Eleanor waiting at the riverside bench. Outside the bar where the cruelty had once unfolded, the group of men was absent. Only a single man leaned against the brick wall, a cigarette between his fingers. When George passed, the man lowered his eyes, flicked the cigarette aside, and straightened his stance. He said nothing, but his silence spoke loudly enough. The automatic door of the grocery opened again behind George, sighing once as another customer stepped out. But the air did not carry the same dismissal, the same indifference it once had. Now every movement around him seemed touched by restraint, by awareness. The town had learned something in its stillness. At the next corner, George paused briefly, his cane tapping against the curb as he steadied himself. A young man reached the step before him, bent quickly, and held the door open. He said nothing, did not make a show of it, but his gesture carried weight. George walked through without hesitation, his silence as dignified as ever. Further down the block, a boy ran from a side street, waving something small in his hand. It was a sticker, an American flag, edges curled from his pocket. He pressed it into George's palm shyly, his voice almost too quiet to hear. "For you, sir." George looked at the sticker for a moment, then pressed it gently against the side of his cane. The colors were faint, the paper flimsy, but it clung there as though it belonged. He gave the boy a steady look, then continued his walk. No words were spoken, but the boy's grin lingered behind him. By the time George reached the crosswalk near the riverside, several people had paused at the curb, waiting to cross. None moved ahead of him. Instead, they stepped aside, their silence deliberate, their posture softened. George tapped his cane once against the pavement, his unspoken acknowledgement sealing the moment. The river glinted in the distance, sunlight breaking across its surface. The bench dedicated to Eleanor waited, its plaque worn but polished by years of weather. George approached it with the same steady gait he always had, lowering himself slowly onto the wood, the bag of apples resting beside him. He unfolded a napkin from his pocket, wiped one of the apples clean, and placed it at his side. The scent of fruit rose faintly in the breeze, mingling with the smell of water and earth. His ritual endured, shaped now not only by memory, but by the presence of unseen witnesses who carried his name with them. In the quiet of that riverside morning, George looked toward the horizon. His breath was calm, his gaze steady. He had endured mockery, humiliation, silence, and now he sat in the presence of respect. He had not sought it. He had not demanded it. But it had been born, quietly, in the hearts of others. The town would remember. Each Thursday, his walk would no longer be invisible. Each step would carry the weight of recognition, not just of George Brown, but of what he represented. Dignity, endurance, sacrifice, unshaken by time, honored at last. And so a new tradition began, not written on paper or carved in stone, but in gestures small and human. The held door, the cleared sidewalk, the apple returned clean. A tradition that would outlast the morning, carried quietly into the days ahead. If stories like this resonate with your heart, like and subscribe for more untold moments of honor and kindness. Let us know where you are watching from, and if this moment brought back memories you carry with you. The best way to honor their memory is to keep listening. Click on the suggested video now, and we will walk together through another untold chapter of courage and sacrifice.